Hello, and welcome to my stories. Today, another installment from my horror archive. I hope you enjoy. The Silvered Prophecy by Martha M.C. Jenkins. Elias Thorne, an architect whose lifeblood was order and the unwavering strength of calculated steel, found himself adrift in a sea of his grandmother's inherited chaos. The Victorian mansion, a hulking edifice of a bygone era, stood on a quiet, tree-lined street, perpetually cloaked in the long shadows of ancient oaks. He'd inherited it a month ago, and since then, his 30s felt less like the prime of his professional life and more like a prolonged state of disquiet. His recurring nightmares, once vague whispers of anxiety, had sharpened into stark, terrifying visions. Crumbling plaster, structural beams groaning under unseen weight, and the suffocating sensation of cold earth pressing in. He'd always attributed them to work stress or the unsettling task of sifting through a lifetime of his grandmother Elara's possessions, but lately they felt personal, or perhaps intrinsic to the house itself. The mansion was Elara incarnate, eccentric, beautiful, and utterly overwhelming. Every surface was a canvas for dust motes dancing in the infrequent shafts of sunlight. Every room a testament to a life lived among treasures and forgotten trinkets. But what truly unsettled Elias was the sheer abundance of mirrors. They were everywhere. Ornate gilt frames held dark, cloudy glass in the parlor. A trio of beveled-edged antique cheval mirrors stood sentry in the master bedroom, and even the narrow, winding stairwell boasted a colossal floor-to-ceiling looking glass that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Elias, a man who calibrated load-bearing walls and designed for optimal egress, found himself increasingly unnerved by reflections. He'd catch his own tired face in a passing glance, then flinch, convinced he'd seen something else, a flicker of movement in his periphery that wasn't his own. He'd rub his eyes, exhaling a weary breath, blaming it on the long hours and the melancholic task of dismantling a beloved life. Stress, he'd mutter, clutching his coffee mug, just stress. His first week in the house was a blur of unpacking boxes and cataloging Elara's vast collection. He tried to impose his own brand of order, making lists, drawing rudimentary floor plans, but the house seemed to resist. Doors creaked open when no breeze stirred, floorboards groaned where no one walked, and the oppressive silence of the empty rooms often felt less like quiet and more like a heavy, stifled breath. It was in the grand drawing room, a cavernous space dominated by a cold fireplace and an enormous rococo-framed mirror above the mantel, that the anomalies became harder to dismiss. He was sorting through a box of ancient photographs, his back to the mirror, when a sudden jarring movement caught his eye in the reflection. He spun around, expecting to see a curtain stirring, a draft, anything. Nothing. The room was still, the air heavy. He looked back at the mirror. His own reflection stared back, a faint tremor in his hand as he picked up another photograph. But for a split second, he swore he saw a faint ripple behind him, like a disturbance in still water or a shadow detaching itself from the wall. He shook his head, a cold prickle chasing down his spine. Get a grip, Elias. You're overtired. He even considered covering the mirrors, but the idea felt absurd. He was a man of science, not superstition. Yet the incidents persisted, a fleeting, indistinct shape at the edge of his vision in the hall mirror as he passed, a momentary blurring of his reflection in the antique dressing table mirror in the guest bedroom, as if the glass itself had briefly exhaled. The recurring nightmares intensified too. They now featured the mansion specifically, its foundations cracking, its ornate plasterwork peeling away like diseased skin, and a distant, almost inaudible wail that seemed to emanate from deep within its very structure. He awoke in a cold sweat most nights, the dread of physical weight on his chest. He started avoiding direct eye contact with the mirrors. He'd keep his gaze fixed on the floor or the ceiling or anything but his own reflection. It felt foolish, adolescent, but he couldn't shake the growing sense of unease. He was being watched, he knew it, but the feeling wasn't malicious, not overtly hostile. It was more like a persistent, desperate vigilance, as if something was trying to reach him, protect him, yet couldn't break through a barrier he himself had erected with his stubborn skepticism. One evening, driven by a gnawing hunger, Elias made his way to the kitchen, a surprisingly modern space Elara had renovated decades ago. As he reached for the refrigerator, his eyes drifted to a small framed mirror hanging above the sink, a charming, unassuming piece that had probably been there for generations. And then he saw it. It wasn't a flicker, or a blur, or a shadow. It was a figure, translucent, shimmering like heat haze, but undeniably present within the reflection of the kitchen. It stood behind him, where the pantry door should have been, a gaunt, elongated form that seemed to radiate a profound sorrow. Elias froze, his breath catching in his throat. His blood ran cold, fear a raw, primal scream in his mind. It's real. The figure didn't move towards him. It didn't lunge or shriek. Instead, slowly, with an almost agonizing deliberation, it lifted a spectral arm and pointed. Its finger, long and thin, indicated the reflected wall directly behind Elias. Then it made a distinct, slow, downward gesture, as if tracing a line from the ceiling to the floor. The movement was clear, insistent. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, then snapped them open. The figure was still there, its silent command echoing in the sudden, deafening quiet of the kitchen. He slowly, painstakingly turned his head, then his entire body, expecting to see something, anything, in the actual space where the ghost had appeared. There was nothing. Just the pantry door, painted a cheerful yellow by Elara, solid and unremarkable. He turned back to the mirror. The figure was gone. Only his own ashen face stared back, eyes wide with a terror he'd never known. He stumbled backwards, knocking over a stack of cookbooks. His logical mind, his architect's brain, screamed for an explanation, for a scientific rationale, but there was none. Sleep became impossible. He spent the night huddled in a chair in the living room, a lamp blazing, staring at the empty spaces where mirrors usually hung, or avoiding those he couldn't remove. He researched local ghost stories, haunted houses, anything. Nothing fit. The ghost wasn't throwing objects or making noises or even manifesting outside the reflective surface. It was unique and terrifyingly specific. The next day, still reeling, Elias forced himself to revisit the spot in the kitchen. He stared at the pantry wall. Nothing. Just an old wall, a bit faded, maybe a faint irregularity in the plaster visible only to a professional eye. He ran his hand over it. Solid. But his intuition, a faculty he rarely acknowledged, buzzed with an insistent urgency. The ghost's gesture had been so clear. Down. The encounters continued, escalating in frequency and urgency. The ghost appeared in the colossal stairwell mirror, its reflected face distorted with what looked like desperate concern, its hand pointing to the ceiling of the grand hall below. In the master bedroom, it manifested in one of the cheval mirrors, its spectral form seemingly manipulating the reflection itself, making the reflected wall behind him mottled and damp, then briefly showing a network of hairline cracks that weren't visible in reality. Elias was fraying at the edges. He stopped eating properly. His architectural drawings lay abandoned. He was convinced he was losing his mind. But the very specificity of the warnings, the insistent pointing, the downward gestures, it didn't feel like a random haunting. It felt like a message, a desperate plea. He remembered a cryptic line from his grandmother's will. "The house holds its secrets close, Elias, but some things are meant to be found." He dismissed it as Elara's usual poetic flair. Now it felt like a breadcrumb. One afternoon, standing in the grand hall, overwhelmed by the echoing silence and the omnipresent gaze of the stairwell mirror, Elias snapped. He looked directly into the mirror, his reflection gaunt, haunted. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. "What are you trying to tell me?" The air in the hall grew cold. The spectral figure appeared again, clearer this time, hovering just over Elias's reflected shoulder. Its face, though indistinct, held a profound sadness and an almost frantic urgency. It began to point, not just generally, but with a series of quick, sharp gestures. First, to the ceiling directly above the massive fireplace. Then it traced a faint, wavering line down the wall, disappearing behind the mantelpiece. Finally, it pointed to the very floorboards beneath the mantel. But this time, as it pointed, the reflection in the mirror warped. For a terrifying moment, Elias saw not the grand hall, but a distorted, crumbling version of it. He saw the ceiling joists above the fireplace sagging precariously, the plaster cracking like an eggshell, and a dark, damp stain spreading rapidly across the reflected wall. Then, just as quickly, the vision faded, replaced by the familiar grandeur of the actual hall. A shard of memory broke through Elias's terror. His grandmother, years ago, had briefly mentioned a problem with the chimney breast during a particularly bad storm, but had dismissed it as fixed. And then a deeper, almost forgotten memory surfaced, a faded photograph on Elara's desk, one of the few she kept prominently displayed, showing her as a young woman standing proudly in this very hall, a slightly mischievous glint in her eye, next to a newly installed fireplace. A newly installed fireplace? In a house this old? He pulled out his phone, accessing the original blueprints of the house stored digitally from his initial survey. He cross-referenced them with a set of old hand-drawn renovation plans he'd found tucked away in Elara's attic. His architect's eyes scanned the details, the structural integrity, the load paths, and then he saw it. A critical error. The original blueprints showed a supporting wall that had been removed during a renovation, likely the one Elara had undertaken, perhaps to create a more open-plan living space in the grand hall. The new, larger fireplace and mantelpiece had been installed without adequate structural support to compensate for the removed wall and the added weight above. The weight of the chimney breast, the upper floor, possibly even the roof, was being distributed incorrectly, creating immense stress on a single, overburdened beam, now hidden behind the new plasterwork. The recurring nightmares, the cracking plaster, the sagging joists, they weren't just nightmares, they were premonitions. The ghost wasn't haunting him, it was Elara, or perhaps the desperate memory of her own mistake, trying to rectify it through him. It was a warning. Elias wasted no time. He hired a structural engineer, a team of contractors. The work was invasive, messy. They had to carefully remove sections of the wall around the fireplace, peel back the elegant plasterwork. As they exposed the underlying structure, the truth became horrifyingly clear. A massive, load-bearing beam was riddled with dry rot, weakened by decades of stress and a slow, insidious water leak from the old chimney stack. It was splintered in places, barely holding its immense load. A catastrophic collapse was not a possibility, it was an inevitability, perhaps triggered by the next major tremor or heavy storm. Underneath the hearth, tucked into a small, dry-rotted cavity, Elias found a small, tarnished silver locket. Inside, a miniature photograph of Elara as a young woman, vibrant and full of life, next to a tiny, almost illegible inscription, "Forgive my pride, my love. Protect what is precious." As the contractors worked to shore up the structure, replacing the compromised beam with new steel and reinforced concrete, Elias felt a profound shift within himself. The creeping dread began to recede, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief and a deep, unexpected gratitude. He understood now. Elara, his logical, fiercely independent grandmother, had made a grave structural error, perhaps out of youthful impatience or a desire to modernize her beloved home. She had likely known the danger, lived with its silent threat, and when she passed, her essence, her desperate need to protect her last living relative from her legacy, had manifested in the only way it could, through the ubiquitous mirrors she had loved so much. The nightmares ceased. The spectral figure no longer appeared in the mirrors. Instead, when Elias looked into the polished glass, he saw only his own reflection, calmer, more settled, a quiet understanding in his eyes. The house, once a source of terror, began to feel like a home. He wasn't just fixing a structural flaw. He was healing an inherited trauma, laying to rest a family secret, and finally, truly, accepting a part of his grandmother he'd never known. Elias Thorne, the logical architect, had learned that some truths existed beyond blueprints and physics, that intuition, the quiet whispers of the unseen, could be as vital as any calculation. He still valued order and logic, but he now understood there were dimensions to reality that defied neat categorization, dimensions where love and protection transcended death itself. The mirrors in the Victorian mansion, once unsettling portals to his deepest fears, now reflected a quiet assurance, a watchful, loving gaze. They were no longer a source of dread, but guardians of a newly restored and deeply cherished home. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. Please also feel free to check out my webpage. Link is in the description. Until next time, my love to you all.